Hi, and welcome back. Kate, you know, a reserve study, as we just talked about, is really just a guess, isn't it? I mean, everything is a guess by the reserve specialist. Why is it so important that we follow it, try to follow it closely?
Well, the reserve study is going to be part roadmap and part recommendation, and having this information is going to be vital because the association board is responsible to fund the reserve and maintain the association assets. And it sounds like it's a huge legal issue, but it's really basically having the money to pay for the projects when the projects are due. You need to follow the study as best you can, but you also have to be a little bit flexible. Sometimes scheduled repairs can wait another year, but they're going to continue to be flagged in the reserve study. So for example, every year we're doing our budget, we look at our reserve study, and the recommendation is that we should replace the refrigerator in the clubhouse. The refrigerator is doing just fine, does not need to be replaced in any way.
Still cold?
Still cold, keeps the ice cold. But it's still a line item in the reserve study, and it says that we should have replaced it 2 years ago. We didn't need to. So you don't have to spend the funds in the reserve study on exactly what it says to do in exactly the year it says to do it, but you need to address those items that are in that reserve study for the current year.
The money needs to be in there when it does fail.
Exactly.
Needs to be there. Right.
When we get 2 years out and suddenly we have ice water on the floor instead of in the refrigerator, that's when you know you've got to have the money available. You also have to really pay attention to any necessary maintenance. So for example, never defer maintenance that could directly affect the safety of your residents or the value of your community. It's possible that you may not have the funds in operating to make routine reserve contributions. If that's the case, you may have to make the very difficult and unpopular decision to do that special assessment. So to give you a different example, we need to perform maintenance on that gate, but maybe we haven't been saving enough in reserves to do the maintenance on that gate, but it's got to be done or maybe even replaced. That might be a point in time when you have to do a special assessment. The problem there, though, you're going to have to explain to your homeowners that the reason you're getting a special assessment is because you delayed funding your reserves, even though the reserve analyst recommended that you put X amount of dollars in each month. You didn't do it, and now they've got to take it out of their own pockets.
You got to pay the piper eventually, right?
You got it. And the other part that most people don't really think about is the insurance company. If you don't do the expected maintenance on those streets and something happens, somebody falls, there's a car that drives through a pothole, loses an axle, the insurance company may choose not to cover it because you chose not to do the maintenance or not to fund the reserve.
You know, I would say that if you're considering doing something like not funding your reserves fully, the first thing you do is you talk to your reserve specialist before you make that decision, because you need to know what the implications might be down the road.
Exactly. We had talked earlier about a reserve study needing to be done every 5 years. But is there ever a reason why we need to update it more frequently?
Absolutely. The thing about a reserve study is that it's a static document. It tells you what reserve funds you're going to be spending in the next X years. But communities aren't static. Like you said, you didn't replace the refrigerator when you were supposed to, according to the reserve specialist, but it was working just fine, and why would you want to replace it early? Now, that's a small, relatively small expense, but what if it was a large expense? And suddenly it affects your reserve study. Your reserve study thinks you have done one thing and you've done something else, or not done something.
Like not replace the asphalt in the street.
Exactly. In fact, I have some personal experience with something like that, where the board got misled because they didn't follow the schedule that the reserve specialist had, and for good reason, but they allowed it to mislead them on how much money. And I'll try to explain this as quickly as I can. Okay. Your reserve study calls for a $20,000 a year contribution to reserves. And that's what the board is doing. They're putting $20,000 a year into reserves. And there's also a repaving the streets. It's supposed to occur this year. The streets need to be repaved, and it's going to cost $75,000. Okay. It's a lot of money. The board looks at the streets and says, you know, we can put this off another year. They look fine. It's okay. Which so they do. Later in the year, in year one, later in the year, they begin to do their budget for next year. And they look at the reserve study and says, well, how much money are we supposed to have for next year? And it says you're going to have this certain amount. And they discover they've got way more money in the reserve account than they're supposed to. It's like 125% of what's recommended. And they congratulate themselves on what a great job they're doing and decide, you know, we probably have better places for that $20,000 a year we're putting in. Why do we want to put $20,000 in when we're 125% of what we're supposed to have?
Well, I'd have to agree with that.
It sounds logical, right? If you don't think about the fact that you were supposed to spend $75,000 and didn't.
Oh.
So they decide not to make that contribution.
Okay.
The next year comes around and they, in fact, do repave the streets. And they begin then to look at their reserve study for their next year's budget and have suddenly found that they're only 60% reserved.
Oh, because now they've had to pay for the streets.
And they didn't put the $20,000
in.
So now, guess what? They're in a lot of trouble, right? They're going to have to raise assessments because they made a mistake. What they should have done is when they know they're making a significant change to their reserve spending, update the reserve study, or have someone tasked with that job to make sure that everybody knows we're going to spend $75,000 this year that's not shown in that year. It actually showed in the prior year. It's a little confusing, but if you stop making contributions because you think it's a good idea, check with your reserve specialist first. He will tell you, excuse me, when are you going to do that street? Oh, next year. You better keep putting your money in, or you're going to find yourself in trouble. So that's an example I have some personal experience with. And if you're a board member, don't do it without talking to your reserve specialist.
Always talk to your expert.
Exactly. And I'll just add a couple more comments on reserves. It's critical that you have a reserve study with all the assets listed. And you may think that as a board member that's not your job, but you know the community better than that reserve specialist does. So when it comes time to do your reserve study, a knowledgeable board member and the manager should probably go through the entire community with that reserve specialist so he knows or she knows, yes, that's we maintain that. No, that's the homeowners. No, that's a city street. So that he knows or she knows exactly what elements comprise your community. All right, Kate, your turn. Some maintenance projects are pretty easy. It doesn't require a lot of thought. You know, it's easy. But when you're facing a complex project, you know, it can be a lot to take in. Where do you start? Where do you go?
I love project planning. This is one of the most fun things I do.
There's something wrong with you.
I think that it's so exciting to be able to find a project, find an issue, create a solution, and then see it through to the end. And I think that if more board members considered it that way, they'd have a lot more fun when they were working on these projects.
I like the end part.
Yeah, well, the end always comes. That's the cool part. And then guess what? You get to do another project.
Yep.
So the hard part, I think, for most people is identifying what they need to do and what they've got to do first. And the first thing to do is look at your annual budget and look at your reserve study. These are places where someone else, an expert, has already identified things that you've got to monitor. I say to look at your annual, including and your reserve, because both of them are going to give you key indicators as to what you want to do next. Maybe the monthly or the annual budget, you've got a landscaping component. And in that landscaping component, your vendor suddenly comes up with an idea that maybe you should replace a large section of irrigation. That goes out of your annual and could possibly go into your reserve. So the two kind of tie together. They give you reference points from where you're going to start.
They also tell you probably how much you're going to spend.
Exactly.
If you have to replace something.
That's the other part. When I do a project at home, I don't always know what the outside costs are going to be going in. But when I do a project with the HOA, I've got the reserve study I can refer to. It's going to have recommended amounts to pay for the project, and it may even have recommendations on things you can do in order to delay or improve your project completion. So for example, let's talk about the streets. If you slurry the streets every 2 years, you can put off having to do a complete remove and replace. And in some cases, you even need to do the slurry in order to keep the warranties good. That's going to be in your reserve study, and that recommendation is going to be there along with the dollar amount. It means that every time you put those funds into your reserves, you're identifying where those funds are going to go, and then you're going to know what project you need to do and what project you're going to need to do first. Now, my other favorite thing, the thing that I love, the thing that I keep up in our community, this is your completed project list. And it is something that the homeowners or that the board members are maintaining. This isn't maintained by the community manager because they've got a lot of communities they manage and we only have one. We're better adept at keeping something like this current. We actually hang this in the clubhouse, and as we have our meetings, we can go in, make a notation, and then eventually somebody will take it home, update the Excel spreadsheet, print out a new one, and we start over again. It includes the project, when it was completed, and even the vendor. You can include more information here if you want to, but what's cool about this is, let's say every 2 years or 3 years, we have to go through and we've got to do maintenance or at least an inspection on the roofs of our condo complex. You can go through your financials, try and figure out which vendor you used, or you can go to your project list. You can see when roofs were worked on last, who did it, and whether or not you gave them an A+ for what they did. This gives you an idea of where you've been, and it can really show you where you need to go. So I love my project list. You know I love my project list.
It's great, you know, and I think you bring up an important point. Managers, they're employees of another company. Mm-hmm. They do change jobs from time to time, and you may find yourself over a period of 5 years with more than one manager.
Exactly.
Sometimes more than two. They're not going to have the continuity to remember all of the projects you've done over that time period. Mm-hmm. But the people who are on the board live in the community. They only have one community to worry about, as you said. And if they keep this, you now have something that stays with the community in perpetuity. And I always like to say, you know, it's not the manager's community. It's your
yours.
community. And while you expect your manager to do a lot of things for you, keeping the history of your community is probably not going to be one of them.
Managers keep an inordinate amount of records and documentation, and so along with the completed project list, we keep our red book. This actually stays in the clubhouse, and it's like you said, you have changes in managers within an organization, you change vendors, well, you also change board members. And occasionally, you're going to need to know a little bit more than the name of a company or when the project was done. So in addition to the project list, you can refer back to your maintenance schedule. And this is very cool because it's got all these fabulous tabs in it, and you've got a project contract, you might have notes, copies of emails, you've got your timeline, completed schedules, and you've got references to everything that's been done so that any board member or any community member can take a look at this, they understand what's going on, where it was done, who did it, and why. So you've got the reserve study, your annual budget, you have the fabulous project list, which we must keep in our clubhouse, and then you've got even more detail available in your maintenance manual. And these are the things that I always refer to anytime our community is looking at a new project. Isn't that fun?
That is fun. You know,
see, I told you projects were fun.
It's fun when it's done.
That is very, very true.
One of the things that you then get into after you've gone through your reserve study and everything is, what are the problems you need to deal with?
Exactly.
Is it a maintenance issue? Is it a repair issue? Is it a replacement issue? Whatever it might be.
Is it something you have to do right now?
It's a problem-solving approach.
Exactly.
And so we're going to talk a little bit about how to solve these problems to determine what's going to be done. And it consists of a few steps. Identifying the scope of the problem. Is it a big one or a little one? Determining who has the authority or the obligation to fix it. What are the alternatives? Putting a plan together, communicating that plan, and monitoring and evaluating the plan itself. So I'm going to start off with the first step in problem solving, that is the scope of the problem. If you don't know what the scope of the problem is, it's pretty hard to do almost anything else.
True.
So where do you start? Well, what is it? Is it a leak? Is it are they pipes in the wall of a condominium? Is it the roof that's falling in or something? Who owns the fence that's having a problem? the size and complexity of the problem will have a direct impact on your plan. So do you need a general contractor? You can kind of figure that out pretty quickly. If you've got more than three different sub contractors involved, you're going to have a general contractor. Is it an emergency? Do you need help? All those things help you understand what you're faced with. And once you know what you're faced with, then you can go on to the remaining steps, which we're going to cover in segment 3 of this presentation. So stay with us and come back for the next segment. Thank you.